Today on Rebuilders, we are talking about two things really. First of all, what we've been seeing happening in the world, how God has been moving through his church. Mark, you had the privilege of travelling to the UK, being part of the leadership conference in London, and also visiting a number of other churches and meeting a bunch of people, and are very excited about what's happening across the world. And also, after the events of the weekend, we are going to be talking about Russia.
Yes.
We cannot miss that opportunity. But it has been a while since we have been at the microphones and chatting with you guys. And yeah, Mark, just like to throw to you to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, we intended on being back a while ago, but as many of you perhaps know, and maybe some of you don't know, as a family we received some quite sort of life-changing news, which when I was in London, I got a call at the end of my trip from my wife Trudy, who had been diagnosed with breast cancer, which they're now treating as it has spread, so metastasized. So it's been quite a challenging thing to face, and I just wanted to firstly just thank all of the listeners who have sent in messages via email, social media. It's been incredibly humbling to see just people across the world praying for us and holding us up as a family, and Trudy in prayer. And it's been literally, I put up something on Instagram and it just, so many people sent message. I lost the ability to get back to everyone. And but I just wanted to thank people. It's been incredibly humbling, and we have really felt carried in that. So I've had to adjust, and as Trudy's begun treatment now and sort of caring for her, and so I'm sort of doing my duties here at Red, and but have pulled back on all my sort of external speaking and other podcasts and stuff like this, but just really wanted to sort of get back into Rebuilders, as this is one way which we can sort of contribute after having a little bit of a break. So I think, as I said a couple of years ago when COVID kicked off, this is not going to be an event, it's going to be a journey. And very much feel that for us and our family, and very much in the midst of it. But yeah, just wanted to be open. I think we've been really open about our successes, but also the difficult times, and we know that can minister to people. But just wanted to say that up front. And yeah, if people are asking how to pray, I think praying for Trudy, praying for healing, praying for the treatment, praying for our kids and family, and also just for Red Church. I think as long-term listeners will know, Melbourne went through a long lockdown, and churches all over the world have had difficulty coming out of lockdowns, and we've experienced that and went through a difficult season in the last period, and then coming into this, it's been tough, but God's still moving in the midst of it. So keen to talk about those things, but just wanted to share that as we began.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Well, let's get into the episode. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy, and I'm here with Mark and Daniel.
G'day.
How are you both going?
Good.
Well, can I just say, I think one of the things that we try and attempt to do on this podcast is convince our overseas listeners that, we don't fight snakes every day and live in the Outback.
Is that what we've done? Convince them.
And that's one of our prime objectives. And, that we actually live in a republic of flat whites and, street art. But actually, Daniel has just ruined all of that and has spent approximately 3 weeks
Wrestling snakes.
Literally going full crocodile hunter, riding a motorbike through the bush. Seeing literal. Did you see a kangaroo killed by a flock of eagles? Is this true?
What?
And is it called a flock?
I don't reckon they would be.
A gaggle of eagles.
They would not be a gaggle. I'm going to look up what the collective noun of.
That's right, I'm already over it.
Okay, thank you.
It's a saw.
A saw? How do you spell that?
SOAR.
Yeah, well done. A saw of eagles.
Which is interesting.
Also can be called, hang on, can also be called convocation.
A convocation.
Isn't that what's like
an airy?
Vatican?
A-E-R-I-E, or even a spread.
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, multiple names.
So this convocation, this saw, this spread of eagles, were they killing a kangaroo or a wallaby?
This time around, I didn't see them taking down a kangaroo. I have seen them take down kangaroos before.
Really?
But I did see them.
Full grown, like
full
kangaroo.
Like the bald eagles over here. No, wedge-tailed eagles.
Wedge-tailed eagles. The bald eagles are only in America, and that guy on the Muppets. Remember, wasn't there a bald eagle on the Muppets?
Yeah.
Wedge-tailed eagles. Yeah, they're massive. Like you see the wingspan, it's like 2 meters across, and so easy. A few of them take down a
I've
kangaroo.
never
Saw it.
heard
I
of
did see them
such madness.
devouring the carcass of a kangaroo.
Wow.
Just what
But
people-
you went deep. You went deep into Australia's red heart.
Yeah. So I've just got back last week from a 3-week motorbike trip around South Australia, which is my home state, and most of it was off road. So it was through the Outback. So if you've got in mind, to our listeners, in Australia, if you have in mind red dirt, flat, and a big red rock,
Which is what they think Australia is.
yeah,
most
that's
of
where I
us.
was.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
didn't go to
You didn't go to the rock.
Yalara, but no, didn't make it up there.
How many snakes did you see?
0, it's winter, so they're all hibernating.
Underground.
Yeah. Did chase an emu down the road for a bit. That was fun. Plenty of roos and heaps of bird wildlife. But it's just like, I think because I was born out that way and lived out that way when in my 20s, like it's just I just find it such a beautiful part of Australia. It's just, there's not heaps there, but there's just a beauty there. There's just being able to see horizon to horizon, see the sunset, sunrise, see the weather come and go. It's pretty amazing. So yeah, great. And I came back to Melbourne, it was like every day up there was like 25 degrees and sunny, which for 77 Fahrenheit and sunny. Come back to Melbourne where it's like 12 degrees and
What's that in
hailing.
Fahrenheit?
Yeah.
It was 10. It was like 8 degrees the other day. I think I was coming back from church on Sunday night. It was like 8 or something.
10 degrees Celsius is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So
So we're in winter.
Yeah.
But thank you for fully Australianifying our
it was a rich experience.
sending the country boy back to the country.
My heart's singing. Right, just having days where you don't shower and wear the same clothes.
I'm from the country and I enjoy showering every day. Thank you.
No, I'm all about it. But
I was catching the tube around London. I enjoy that. The
Yeah.
city, planning what coffee stops on the way around a subway system. That's my good time.
jam.
I went to the Grampians in.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Bit of hiking.
Yep. Did some hiking.
Yep.
Climbed some mountains. It was delightful.
It's so nice out there.
Oh my gosh, it's my favorite place.
Yeah.
Favorite place.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm back. We're back.
Yeah.
Australia.
Australia, mate.
Yep. All right. Well, let's get into some of what we want to talk about today.
Yeah.
Let's start with what we've been seeing happening. A number of months ago now, we had Pete Gregg on talking about Asbury and his experience there. Then we did an episode not long after that about an experience that we had here at Red as part of renewal sessions that we were running at the time. And yeah, again, there's these spot fires that are still burning away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was really interesting to go to the leadership conference, which is put on by Alpha Holy Trinity Brompton, and some people jokingly call it the Christian UN. And at the Royal Albert Hall, which is an amazing building, and what I loved was just talking to people from all over the world, and you can do that electronically through the internet, but just sitting down with people and just a sense is really what I picked up. Two things. I think there is a definite sense that things have changed. I got that from talking to people from all over the place, Malaysia, Canada, you name it. That God is doing something new, that things had to change in a way, and that they're sort of moving from one period into a new period, and the contours of the new period are not really here. I did just want to say as well, just interrupt my thought for 1 second, it was so great to meet a bunch of Rebuilders listeners. So thank you to everyone who came up and to be in this place where lots of people from around the world were, and it was just really humbling and reassuring because often we're here in our studio on the bottom of the world. But just thank you, just so great to meet people and thanks for all who said hi. So there's definitely a sense that I think we're moving into a new era, but it was just really interesting being at the conference in the sense of I got to share the stage with, a lady who'd planted a church in a North Korean prison.
Wow.
The Bishop of South Sudan, and just different themes. I think, the themes often at conferences have been success and often, I heard someone say at the conference, in the past, the leadership conference would have lots of things from the business world, and they had a little bit of that, but it was this sense of God's doing a new thing. And on I think it was the night after I spoke, had people share David Thomas and others, some of the students who'd been at the Asbury outpouring, but it wasn't just about Asbury as much as I think Asbury rather is a manifestation of something that is happening all over the place. We had Rob Lim, who is an Aussie who's on staff at Asbury, shared our church last week. And just this really common sense that God is doing this new thing, that it's humble, it's quiet, it's holy. And in some ways, I think part of perhaps what the adjustment many of us are finding at the moment is that I think God wants to bring a new equipping, a new empowering, but it's adjusting to the contours of it.
Yes.
It's interesting when you think about that there's a whole, I think, generation of people who particularly, being in England, which is really, the UK, which has been really touched by, I think, the charismatic renewal, particularly in the sort of 80s and 90s, had a particular flavour. Part of that was sometimes louder. And, you think of English Anglicanism, which, perhaps was, I don't want to get into like caricatures and cliches, but, this sort of loudness and the awakening and the sort of moving people out of, I guess, perhaps patterns of the past was something really cool. But it's almost now it's like after a period where things have been very loud, very platform driven, very big personality driven. I just think there is this access point to something new and fresh. And I think part of what I think God is calling leaders to do at the moment is being aware of what he's doing and aware of the contours of this new move. Because if you can understand the contours, you're still going to understand how to posture ourselves. I'm interested in what you guys think about too, how you're seeing it playing out here as well.
Interestingly, like just as you were talking, it made me think back to a number of episodes that we've done over the past 2 years where you've been talking about how the world, culture, the West is in this state of transition, that we're in between two eras. And it should be unsurprising, I suppose, that we're seeing this happening in the church as well. Yes. That was, just an observation that I was thinking of.
Yeah. What about you, Daniel?
I think I've just been encouraged by just the stories that we're hearing, the testimony of just faithful people that have walked with Jesus for years, that are just encountering him in a new and a fresh way, and there's a stirring that they haven't felt before, and it's not just like something that happened in their youth. It's something new. It's something we were even just chatting about it as a team before. This kind of call to repentance. It's not just a call to kind of not do the wrong thing and not sin. It's actually there's more to of turning and walking the opposite direction, and actually that word like holiness and surrender and obedience. So there is we're seeing and hearing stories of renewal in the micro.
Yes.
But when you begin to see that happening across a church community, you go, there's something to this, and I suppose in context of what's happening around the world and what we're seeing and hearing, it's so encouraging. And building faith in our community for sure.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I noticed too, which is really, really interesting, is it's not attached, like the thing God's doing in the world doesn't seem to be attached to a big personality.
Yeah.
Often there's a personality or a charismatic figure or a group of charismatic figures, and I mean charismatic in the personality sense. But also too, it's not necessarily like there is definitely the Asbury thing, but just being in London and also the messages we've received and talking to people we know, it is happening everywhere. It was interesting, when I was in London, some people sort of asking the question, the Asbury thing, is this, I was having a really interesting chat to a gentleman from South Africa about this, an event just after, he sort of said, often you're seeing these things happen in Africa. Is this getting like, I guess, more coverage because it's in America? And I think it's a really good question because, America's obviously the most sort of powerful nation in the world and often gets attention. But even hearing the stories of how this is happening in places like Asia, Thailand, Japan, this thing, this is not something that is happening just in one place, one country, one leader. And what I'm really fascinated by as well is not just happening at the big mega churches that are famous. Like actually almost what I'm noticing is it's happening at smaller churches, medium-sized churches, churches that aren't super cool. It's really interesting. There's something so countercultural to this, to the spirit of the age that I think the church has been shaped by in the last little period. And, we had that a little bit. We had, when Rob Lim came and, shared with us, we had our first service and it was very full but then we had our second service. So we planted a new service, 6 p.m. And so some people from our 11 have gone to the 6. So we knew it was going to be a little bit smaller as it, when it sort of fills up. And, the service began and I was talking to Britt, who's on our team, about this. And we were like, it's a bit small today. We need to talk to them. We planted out of this, it's going to fill that space, et cetera, et cetera. But then we just were sort of almost like felt chastised by the end, because at the end we sort of just opened it up and I honestly felt like 85% of the people were down the front in the congregation, sort of like praying, and it went for an hour. Like there were people still there, I think an hour and a half after the service had closed. And so I think my sort of brain of like, this is good because there's lots of people in the room, got really challenged, and that's shifting to me. It's gone from how many people in the room or how many butts on seats to how many people is the Spirit moving in and are consecrating themselves and giving themselves wholly to God. So I think there's a sort of changing of metrics that's at play, and I'm looking forward to narrating that story as we sort of go forward from here.
Yeah, the thing I noticed, like hosting the services on Sunday, and what I've sort of noticed over the last number of months is there is a desire and willingness to dwell.
Yes.
Which I haven't seen before.
Yes.
When you're up the front, you can see the congregation, and it's these beautiful moments that are so humble and gentle, which I think are very emblematic of what people have been sharing in their experiences across the world with what God's up to.
And it's interesting as well, because I think like lingering, and I don't know if Rob said this in the service, but lingering, there's something profoundly countercultural to it. Like, there was almost this thing of like, how do we shorten churches down, services down, because people are going to get to kids sport or this or that, or we're busy, and there's an element of like, does that also speak of the fact that we're shrinking the place of Him in our lives?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying here we have to do like 17-hour services or anything, but that there's something happening. And again, too, I think this is like, I think Pete Hughes, who's from KXC in London, has talked about, I think this is like spring rains. It's the first rains of something. It's new sprigs coming up that, to see. One of the things I've just tried to talk about is the lack of devotion is one of the things that's been harming the church in the West, and there's been this double-mindedness. But to see people, many of them young people, lingering is just a really encouraging sign, lingering in Jesus' presence.
Yeah, and there's also been that word of like perseverance, like waiting and persevering, which I think is like in the same vein as lingering. Yeah, and a waiting for his presence and his move and his leading.
Yeah. As Rob said at the end, Aslan's on the move. And I think that's a great way of summarising what's happening now.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Well, I look forward to continuing that conversation.
Yes.
And again, I mean, we said this in an episode many months ago, but if you do have stories of what God is doing in your setting, we'd love to hear about them. And share them with others. It's so important to share what God is doing.
Yeah.
All right, let's shift gears.
What a segue we're about to engage in.
Yeah. Buckle up.
It's like we're going 100 miles on the freeway and we're about to
slam it into reverse.
Yes, pull the handbrake, fishtail, opposite direction.
Russia.
Yeah. Big news.
Big news.
And big news not just for Russia, but obviously, what happens in Russia has tremendous geopolitical implications. Russia is the world's second largest holder of nuclear weapons, and also one of the world's largest oil and gas producers. And as the Qatari foreign minister tweeted in the midst of this crisis, that this could have tremendous implications on the world's oil prices, energy prices. So. Future of Europe, what happens in Russia is deeply connected to the geopolitical world we're in. And as you've learned on this podcast, that culture is downstream from geopolitics.
Yes. So let's maybe start with just the basics of what's the update.
Okay, so the reason I thought it'd be good to do this is obviously this is a big thing in the news, and part of what we do on Reba is, as well as narrating what God's doing in the world, is also helping people analyze and interpret what's happening in the world, because it's often a confusing space out there. So the first thing I just want to say is, part of the reason I want to do this as well is that everyone is bamboozled by the events of the last 72 hours or something. So to go back to the beginning, so I'll say what happened over the weekend, and then I'll go back to a bit of background. Is effectively news around the world was captured by the story that a private military company of mercenaries, and I'll get into that, called Wagner, being led by their oligarch leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was leaving the sort of front line in Ukraine and heading back into Russia in a confrontation with the Ministry of Defense. They very quickly took the city of Rostov-on-Don, which is a significant city. It was one of the sites of one of the World Cup games. And they quickly overtook that city and then continued in a convoy towards Moscow. The rhetoric changed as they headed towards Moscow, and previously their sort of beef was with the officials of the basically Russian military, particularly the defense chief, Sergei Shoigu, and Gerasimov, who's the sort of head of the army. But then it changed to Putin. And no one has challenged Putin that directly for years, and lived to tell the tale, or not be imprisoned like Alexei Navalny. So this was looking like it was heading towards a serious potential of not just a coup, but really looked more like a civil war.
Yeah, okay.
And there's a long history of civil war in Russia at various key historical moments. You go back to the Russian Revolution, 1917, which led into an extended civil war, which went for a number of years, sort of traversing the landmass of Russia. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, there was, almost a threat again when Parliament was shelled at the beginning of the 90s. I think it was 91. Eventually Boris Yeltsin sort of emerged from that sort of internal strife. But what is interesting? Well, okay, let me go back. Look, Wagner, and then I'm going to say why this is interesting, not just about Russia, but I think there's a bigger interesting thing this is telling us about our world. So this is going to go to a bigger principle. So first of all, how on earth did this happen? So, obviously Vladimir Putin, I think the listeners of this podcast will know that he is the ruler of Russia and has created what some have called a power vertical, which is a very strong grip on power. Part of that has been, since the Soviet Union transitioned from being a communist state, it ended into a period of wild capitalism where a lot of the major industries were sort of taken over by various oligarchs. And in some ways, to understand how power works in Russia, you can understand that Putin is sort of the boss of these various smaller bosses over various industries. In 2014, Wagner was created, and what Wagner is a mercenary group. It's a private army.
Okay.
And this is not just something that Russia created. In the Iraq War, the second Gulf War, the US military realized, that it was sort of making a transition and began to use private military contractors. That's what PMCs are called. And Dick Cheney, who was the vice president, famously and quite suspiciously awarded a lot of the sort of contracts to his firm Halliburton. But there was also another private military contractor called Blackwater, which are basically armed guys that are paid to do soldier-like stuff, but are not part of a government's military. And so Eric Prince, who started Blackwater, sort of started that. So doing a lot of security and stuff that they didn't want soldiers. As armies, it's harder to get soldiers to volunteer and also to not do drafts. It's like privatization of war is what we're seeing.
Okay.
So famously, Eric Prince, I think, approached the White House, maybe during the Trump administration, actually said he was offering to privatize the war in Afghanistan and just run it as mercenaries. Mercenaries have sort of been looked down upon in the last 100 years, or they're used often throughout history. And Eric Prince went on to sort of create a private army of a lot of Colombian soldiers for the United Arab Emirates and its leader, Mohammed bin Zayed. So they're becoming more and more popular. But Wagner has probably been the most popular. Now, it is a private, but also is deeply connected to the Russian state.
Okay.
So the former FBI agent Ali Soufan runs this sort of think tank which looks at terrorism and stuff like this. And they did a large report on Wagner and said basically it's an extension of the Russian state. So in a sense, it gives the Russian state deniability to actually do things that they don't want blamed on themselves.
Yes.
Now,
okay.
again, before we just get into Russia bashing, Blackwater has been accused of doing things for the Central Intelligence Agency that the US government want to deny plausibility. So it's not just Russia which does this. It was used, basically emerged out of the original sort of conflict in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass in 2014. It actually wasn't started by Prigozhin. It was actually started by a guy called Dmitry Utkin. Not a nice bloke, I can say. He is a neo-Nazi and is a neo-pagan and just a really nasty character. So in a sense, these are sort of hired thugs that the Kremlin can use for various sort of operations. They're also involved in some of the troll farms that began to, be accused of various things from election interference to online information warfare.
Yeah, right.
They then got not just involved in eastern Ukraine in 2014, but particularly their real footprint has been in Africa and all over Africa. So basically being a footprint of doing things that the Russian state wants to happen in Africa. There's been, if you follow African politics at all, you've seen that there's been an increased pushback against sort of French presence in Africa.
Yeah.
And lots of countries which have formerly been, former French colonies, Francophone countries. All of a sudden you see these images on Twitter of people holding up Russian flags and tearing down the French flag.
Oh, interesting.
And so in some ways, this is being used by the Russian state to push back on Western influence in Africa.
Yeah.
But also in Syria as well. One of the pivots that Putin did was to move into Syria. And as the US, Obama made a pivot away from the Middle East towards Asia, is that it gave an opportunity for Russia to have more of a footprint. And so the dictator of Syria, Assad, basically Wagner has been a bit of a force that is used. But also in places like Central African Republic, they attempted to quash a coup in Mozambique. So really it's been this force used in the world. And then particularly when the war in Ukraine started, it came back to be a fighting force. And particularly in battles like Bakhmut, it has been connected to the Russian army, but also a little bit separate from it. And this is where the problems begin. So Yevgeny Prigozhin, again, to a character you almost sort of couldn't make up. When, as I said, Russia, when it stopped communism, there was this period where different people grabbed different industries. He started as a hot dog. He was in prison, came with the Russian prison system, so linked to crime. Started as a hot dog seller in St. Petersburg, but grew that into a restaurant business and a very sort of expensive restaurant that he had on the water in St. Petersburg.
Okay.
So that's where Putin's from. So a lot of the St. Petersburg elite enabled him to get close to them and get close to Putin.
Yeah.
So state dinners with, I think, the Japanese president or prime minister and George W. Bush were at this restaurant. Putin would take them there. So Prigozhin was sort of the one serving the food. So you can see these photos of him with George W. Bush. So this enabled him to get close to Putin, and then he was awarded a whole bunch of contracts around food, like for schools and the army and stuff like this, and became an oligarch, really providing catering services. But then he was given Wagner to sort of build up. But effectively, as the war in Ukraine began, a lot of these sort of more extreme. So what a lot of people don't realize is in Russia, the Russian opposition, there is a small, Russian opposition who may be liberal or to the left of Putin, but most of the opposition is actually to the right of Putin. So actually Putin is moderate compared to many of those on the right. And there's sort of like some people call them the turbo patriots, or the further on the Russian right. They were sort of excited when the Ukraine war began, but then increasingly they've become frustrated as the war's faltered, and particularly Ukraine made a sort of pushback, pushing the Russian forces back. And so a lot of the blame's gone against the Ministry of Defense, and Shoigu in particular is the head of the defense chief. Not a military guy, came out of emergency services, so they sort of blamed him. He's also not ethnically Russian. He's Tuvan, which is a Mongol people. So this has just been brewing on social media and been brewing and brewing and brewing until it all exploded in this sort of like internal. So almost in some ways, Wagner has been like a private military. It's Frankenstein's monster that then attacks Frankenstein's. So that's the background. But what I find interesting, and this is where I think it's interesting that it tells us something about our world at the moment. So Prigozhin has been threatening Gerasimov and Shoigu for ages, and all of the experts inside Russia, outside Russia, are sort of been like, this is all just talk. You got to realize these guys are a bit crazy. This is sort of like prison, tough guy contests. They're not going to do anything. And there had been some few skirmishes between Wagner units and sort of the Russian military. So when he actually attacked, everyone got taken by surprise. So all of the predictions were fundamentally wrong that Prigozhin was not going to follow through on this. No one thought he would leave the front and attack. So basically you saw all of these people who were making predictions that this was all talk, all of a sudden having to walk back their predictions. It was stunning to see this in the media, on Twitter and all these places. Then as he very quickly took Rostov-on-Don, which again to all of the sort of experts thought the Russian military would make, quick sort of mincemeat of the Wagner forces, you then saw him continue on to Moscow. And then it flipped from, he's not going to do anything, to Russia's going to collapse, Putin's going to collapse, there's a civil war coming, this is insane, get ready, he's going to grab nukes, all this sort of talk. And then to everyone's surprise again, the unpredictable happened and he turned around and went home. And then what you've seen is, and this has been remarkable, literally like this morning, I think it was yesterday, I awoke to a gazillion Twitter threads from various experts, all trying to piece together what on earth happened in Russia. And no one has a clue. So basically what happened was Putin came out and said that he was going to sort of prosecute Prigozhin and strike down Wagner, and they started actually bombing, the Russian Air Force started bombing the convoy. And, like everyone's like, there's no way he's going to back down. Putin wouldn't back down. Now it'll make him look weak. Then enter stage left, the surprise figure of Lukashenko, who's the dictator of Belarus, who looks super weak according to many of the analysts after he was almost deposed in sort of, public protests, and was seen as the weak partner to Putin. He swans in and sort of does this deal supposedly between Prigozhin and Putin, and which Prigozhin's going to head to Belarus and sort of hang out there. And everyone's like, just forget about it. It was like this weird thing. We're going to prosecute you. We're going to take you out. Forget about it. It's like nothing happened. And it has just taken the entire commentary class by surprise. I'll pause there if you guys have got any questions, because I just spoke for about 5 minutes on lots of stuff.
It was impressive. It like the predictability, right? That was, yes. I feel like that was happening back in the day when Putin was originally, threatening to invade Ukraine, and there were a whole host of people being like, "Oh, it's not going to do it. He's just posturing,"
Yes, including me.
Yes,
yes, on this podcast.
And then the history books are written the way they are now. So it feels like this is the nature of unpredictability of geopolitics at the moment.
Yes.
Particularly with Russia.
So I think this, like in thinking about this and thinking about how I talk about this is, I'm not even going to, so that you got every kind of possibility being trotted out at the moment. That number one, Putin's very weak now, and that Prigozhin's like Yeah, he's backed off, but he's shown how brittle the Russian state is. To other people saying, well, this has shown how strong Putin is. You know, Prigozhin's broke down, and actually all the people who are disloyal have shown their heads. And what a master move by Putin. You literally saw, I think it's Koffler, she's a former CIA analyst, was on Fox News this morning saying this is all part of a massive master plan that's they're secretly moving Wagner troops into Belarus because then they're just really close to Kyiv and they can invade from, create this northern front. So it's everything from Putin's weak to Putin's the master strategist to Prigozhin's a dead man to Prigozhin's now stronger. Like every single possibility has been trotted out. The CIA came out and basically said that they'd known about this for a couple of weeks. They didn't share the intelligence with anyone. I mean, is that true? Is everyone just trying to cover their butts here because no one knew anything? And so to help us think about this, and I want to introduce a broader concept. The British scientist and network theorist and cybertician Ross Ashby in 1956, which I knew is where everyone knew where I was going with that.
Yeah,
Everyone's like, he's going to talk about Ross Ashby.
I actually knew that because you told me
I
before,
did tell you
but
that earlier.
otherwise,
I was preparing you
no
for this
idea
pivot.
who
Ross Ashby was one of the first thinkers to think about the world that we now inhabit. We talked about cybernetics, which is really the science which, in a sense, laid the groundwork for the internet age in which we live, networked age in which we live. Along with probably Norbert Wiener is the more famous scientist who sort of set that world out. But Ashby went a little bit ahead of him. And he talked about a number of things, but one thing he's talked about in a sort of a networked world is the concept of a thing called the black box. Now, to understand up to this point, how particularly people in the West have thought about the world, it's through the prism of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is that we must understand everything. We can take apart everything. And once we understand all the composite parts and understand how everything works, then we can proceed forward and operate in the world with confidence. But Ashby, in a sense, turned that on its head. He essentially said that there's going to be these things like black boxes where you can see the inputs going in, you can see the inputs going out, you can see what they do, but you have no idea what's going on inside the black box and how it works. One of the things that the cyberticians predicted was computers would be the ultimate black box. Daniel is smart on tech, so he is currently typing into a laptop. And he probably has more idea than you and I, Liddy, on what is going on inside these black boxes. But ultimately, we use these computers all the time. We have no idea what's going on inside of them. I have no idea what's going on my phone. I can send an email on my phone. I can text you guys. I can ring. I can play a song on Spotify. I have no idea what on earth goes on inside that thing. If you ask me to put one back together, no idea. And this is an increasingly, I think, a metaphor for the world in which we live. Russia is a black box. And one of the things that the social contract of our current regimes of power that exist in the West have said in some ways, the social contract, which is we will rule you because we will do this for you, is that we are smart and we understand how the world works and we have intelligence and data which shows us how the world works. And therefore, we are the best experts to be in control. Well, I think what Russia has shown us now twice in, 18 months, is that the expert class does not always understand how the world works. And there are many black boxes in the world.
Yeah. We
We have no idea what's going on in Russia at the moment. Really interesting little tidbit that very few people noticed was that we had the Discord leaks. I don't know if that's happened since we last were podcasting, where a National Guardsman, young guy, was basically releasing all these US state secrets on a Discord channel, like a gaming channel, I think it was, all these state secrets, like heaps of them. And it's one of the biggest intelligence leaks. And he wasn't doing a sort of Edward Snowden, leaking it for some sort of noble cause. He's just sort of showing off to his mates on some Discord channel. Now, they've revealed a lot of things, and everyone's pretty sure that they're verifiable and they're genuine state secrets. One of the things it says is that Prigozhin was secretly talking to the Ukrainian intelligence services, and that they actually had these multiple channels going on. Another bizarre thing, as I mentioned, Eric Prince, who ran Blackwater, The Intercept reported in 2020 that Eric Prince had actually approached Wagner to work together. So you've got someone who's very much tied. Eric Prince is a donor and was very much tied to, US politics and influential. You've got these back channels. We've got these private military contractors. It's so murky, this world. And we have no idea what's actually going on inside Russia. we have no idea what's actually going on inside China. And actually probably we don't have a lot of idea what's happening inside places like Congress and these giant investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, who are hugely influential in the world. We've got no idea what's going on inside these places. So we increasingly live in a world where we know less and less. And that challenges, I think, many of our assumptions that we can just educate ourselves well, move forward and have confidence and be the radical individual who can sort of understand what's going on in the world. Actually, what it does is it puts you in, there's a room where there's a really important meetings happening that affect your life and you can't get in. You haven't got the security code.
Yep.
That's effectively what this means. And I think that doesn't just mean that for us as individuals, we're small people, but also it means for many of the people who think they're important, they don't really know what's going on. So I think this actually is an increasingly escalating dynamic that we're seeing in the world where the social contract that's been promised to us by our regimes of power is actually starting to fray, where we're going to increasingly have to take a more humble tone that most people have taken throughout history. And I just think it's another piece in the sort of Jenga tower that has been constructed where people are going to start to question the big stories of what's going on. And then they're going to ask for bigger stories. So I think, as I've said before, secularism is structural. Part of secularism is linked to the social contract that our governments and our regimes and those who are in power basically say, we can say this is what reality looks like for you. But increasingly that's being challenged. So I think that that's a really important point and trend line to continue to watch as we go forward, that increasingly we're going to see a world which is unpredictable. And as the world becomes more uncertain and unpredictable, not for everyone, but for many people, that begins to open the doorway to questions of faith and what is going on really, and the sort of existential questions that were dampened, I think, by regimes which said, we've got everything, we can explain it all for you and we're going to provide everything all for you. That crack is beginning to appear. And so the world looks more risky and uncertain, but there's actually an opportunity for the church in that. And there's an evangelistic door that is continuing to creak open. And I think we've been narrating that on this podcast. That's another example of that.
And I think it's interesting pulling together what we're talking about at the beginning of the episode,
yes,
about what God is doing or seems to be doing in the church, and that it is a humble move.
Yes.
So it feels like those two things, that what you're saying there about we're needing to come to this place of humility because we realize that we do not understand or can't understand the way this world is going and what is happening. It brings us to our knees.
Yeah.
And God's doing that with the church as well. So it's kind of this narrative that's going along.
And I go back to that conversation I mentioned earlier I was having with that guy from South Africa, who was sort of asking the question, which is a really good question we need to ask. The Asbury thing, a lot of coverage, all the major networks turned up there. Yet there's events like that often happening in Africa and around the world. And so why? Why is this important? I think the answer is God speaks to us through something like Asbury because maybe a large part of the church thought stuff like that can't happen in the secular West, underneath these regimes of power which shape reality for us, because we actually partially bought the secular lie. So we will go, of course it's going to happen in Africa and there's some massive praise event happening in Nigeria or something. But less likely to think it's going to happen in a Western country, and maybe even for us in Australia, or if you're listening in Norway or New Zealand or Canada or Germany or Spain, that maybe we can still go, it's America, but it's not here. And so I think that partially what God is doing is that story. I saw an interview, it came up on social media, like Robbie Williams. Because everyone knew we're going to go from Russia, Ross Ashby to Robbie Williams, and you're seeing a lot of celebrities actually almost doing this at this point in time. He basically said he's sort of like, he was on a UFO podcast. He's getting big into UFOs. And he was just sort of saying like how increasingly over the last sort of few years, he's just stopped believing all the big stories that the media tell him. And he doesn't believe them anymore. He's just literally he's just become questioning everything, and like the narrative breakdown has occurred for him. And now he's just like, they're like, well, what do you do now? He's sort of like, I just love my family and just try and keep my world very small. And look, that's Robbie Williams. But I think that's a lot of people. And there's a dangerous side to that, because then people can swallow all kinds of things. Like the guy's going to have to skinwalk a ranch and chasing UFOs and whatever. But also there's going to be a bunch of other people who are going to turn up to church who you're not expecting to turn up to church.
Yeah.
And I think we've been conditioned that very sort of developed world, sophisticated people are not going to turn up to church because that was sort of the narrative for sort of 20 years. But I think that you're seeing more and more people question the narrative. If you're seeing sort of stars and famous people like Robbie Williams do that, there's ordinary people doing that. And we need to be attuned that the narrative is starting to break down somewhat.
Yeah. It's almost, well, I know for me, it's been this like challenge of belief. Like, do I believe that God does want to move? And am I willing to break apart all of these expectations that I have constructed or I've taken on to allow him to move in the way that he will and keep my eyes out for when, you know, the person who's serving me coffee wants to have a conversation, you know.
Totally.
It's what are we believing of God and what he wants to do?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so are we willing to let him do it?
Totally. It's a challenge to see that, you know, I've talked about this before and I'll keep talking about it. You know, it's the George Hunter principle. Look for the gap between idols.
Yes.
That gap between idols is increasing. It's only going to be open for a period before the next thing comes in, you know.
Yeah.
And that's a huge advantage. We need to be aware of that and attuned to that. And what if this move of God that he's doing, this humble move of God, is actually prepare us for that opportunity? Do you know what I mean? You know, for what's to come. I think we're at the beginning of it, you know, and maybe it's not like some big moment which energizes the church and they'll come together and it sort of peters away after a few years. What if this is actually an energizing or empowering is a better word, empowering by the Holy Spirit for the next period that we're all going to live in? That's going to look very different from the period we were just in.
Just another thought that's kind of going on over here. Just when you're talking about Russia and the black box, and you've got all these people trying to predict what's going to happen. I've kind of got this parallel thought of, have we tried to do that with God as well? Like I think of Isaiah 55.
Yeah. I was thinking the same.
For my thoughts are not your thoughts and my ways. Like has there been a season of the church where we've tried to work God out, and is this part of the kind of enlightenment move? And is there an invitation back into the mystery of God, into encountering him not intellectually, but into the deeper majesty and sovereignty and mystery, wonder of him again.
And that's a great point. Byung-Chul Han in his book Infocracy. It's a little bit like that. Infocracy is basically what it is. The Korean-German philosopher. He talks about that. I think he talks about black boxes in that, and he talks about that the temple in ancient Greece, there was this sort of secret place where the high priest went and dealt with the hidden knowledge.
Yes.
And a lot of temples had that. And at the Jerusalem temple, there was the place which was the holiest of holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was, and the priest would go in and you know, on the Day of Atonement. But what's really interesting is, and that's the world now, there is that secret sanctum of the initiated elite. And it's not so much magic. What is magic? Magic is information, knowing the secret knowledge and the information.
Yep.
Somewhere in the world at the moment, somewhere in the Russian Ministry of Defense or Wagner HQ or whatever, Putin and you know, his people, someone knows what's going on really. At Langley in the CIA have got more idea of what's going on. You know, somewhere at the headquarters of Blackstone and Vanguard and JP Morgan, they know what's happening with the global economy in ways that we don't. So there's secret meetings. People know stuff that we don't know. That's almost like the inner parts of a temple, you know, and they're almost like the secret elevated priesthood. And the one thing about Gnosticism and magic and paganism is that often it's a cabal of the elite. So a lot of conspiracy theories very rudimentarily try and get at this truth, and they imagine that, you know, there's the World Economic Forum are sort of planning for us to all sort of be dog robots or something. I don't know why I added dog there, you know. And I think that's a very rudimentary way to get at an actual dynamic happens in the world, that there are elites and they have power, and part of power is knowing about information, you know. And think about Google is powerful because it has aggregated so much information in the world. Yeah. So we've got these black boxes. AI is a black box, you know, like there's half the people going, this is going to be amazing. There's all these like social media media posts like, here's the 10 things how AI, ChatGPT can help you become an entrepreneur or a social media star. And then you got other people like, bomb the data centers, it's going to kill everyone. It's like, it's a black box. We don't know what's going to happen. So in a sense, that's our world is a temple, and there is some hidden realm somewhere of people who are smarter than us, have more access than us and more information than us. But you think about what happens when Jesus dies on the cross. The curtain in the temple separating the whole, so ripped from top to bottom. And what that says now is that ordinary people, someone who's a Kenyan coffee farmer in a small village has access to Jesus. There is no hidden initiates who are powerful. That actually it's the upside down kingdom. That the knowledge about God is not hidden. It's in a New Beginning Quarter, it's an open secret. So there's this sense that those who believe and are humble have access to that. So the way to this is not to, go and just schmooze and be a trillionaire at Davos, or to work your way up to the head of an intelligence agency, or to be a president, a king, a prime minister. It's actually to bend your knee to Christ, to humble, to repent, believe the good news, and you have access to the ways of heaven.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you for joining us again today for Rebuilders. We pray that it has been a helpful conversation in understanding the things that are happening geopolitically, but also some insights into what's happening spiritually across the world in God's people. Let's keep praying for more. If you want to know more about the resources or the authors that were mentioned during this episode, we do a subscriber chat mail out. So you can join our subscriber list by heading to rebuilders.co, and we usually send that out a number of days after the episode is released. So you can sign up. We would love to have you on board.